When the assault team breached the outer fence at 2:47 a.m., the CIA officers inside the Polish black site thought they were the targets, until their most dangerous prisoner broke free and started defending them. By the time the sun rose, 3 intelligence agencies would be asking the same question. Whose side was he really on? Before we reveal what happened in those 18 minutes, don't forget to subscribe and tell us which country and city you're watching from. The facility sat 40 kilometers outside Szczytno, buried in dense pine forest where the roads had no names. Site Amber 7 existed on exactly 3 documents in Washington, all locked in safes requiring 2 signatures. 18 detainees, 12 CIA officers, 4 security contractors, and 1 prisoner in the isolation wing who hadn't spoken in 11 days. His intake sheet read, Marcus Webb, nationality uncertain, captured in Yemen. The restraints were military-grade flex cuffs with steel cable reinforcement, rated for 800 pounds of force. He never tested them, just sat against the concrete wall staring at the door like he was counting something invisible. At 2:47 a.m., the perimeter motion sensors went dark in sequence. Not all at once like a power failure, but deliberately, each node dying exactly 4 seconds after the last. The control room called it a malfunction because nothing else made sense. By the time Site Chief Kaplan reached for the alert button, the outer fence was breached in 3 locations. 12 men in non-standard gear moved through the gaps with precision that came from training in facilities that didn't exist. The first explosion hit the generator building 2 seconds before backup lights activated. Kaplan triggered facility-wide lockdown. Steel doors slammed across every corridor, detention cells sealed with magnetic bolts, armory activated biometric locks, 14 seconds from alert to full containment. Except the threat was already inside, flowing through ventilation access points that shouldn't have been on any blueprint. CIA officers moved to defensive positions. 3 at main entry, 2 on administration wing, 4 falling back to the armory. 1 sprinted toward isolation because prisoners were assets, and Torres had good instincts after 6 years with the agency. When he reached cell 7, his hand froze on his sidearm. The prisoner wasn't there. The restraints lay on the floor, not cut but snapped, steel cable frayed at angles that should have shattered human wrists. The door was still magnetically sealed from outside. Torres keyed his radio. 3 words that changed everything. Then hydraulics opened the door behind him, and the man from cell 7 stepped into the corridor wearing Torres's spare tactical vest and holding his backup weapon with the casual competence of someone who had carried one for a very long time. Torres brought his primary weapon up, but didn't fire. The prisoner wasn't pointing the gun at him, wasn't even looking at him, just scanning the corridor with the methodical pattern of someone clearing a threat zone. When his eyes finally settled on Torres, there was something in them that didn't match the intake photo or the interrogation transcripts. The prisoner moved past him without a word. He headed toward the sound of suppressed gunfire echoing from the eastern corridor where the assault team had breached through a maintenance access that CIA thought they had sealed 8 months ago. 2 CIA officers went down in the first exchange, non-lethal hits to body armor that knocked them back, but didn't stop them from returning fire. The attackers advanced with smooth tactical flow, a unit that had run this scenario dozens of times. Except they hadn't run it with the variable that was now moving through the facility like a ghost who knew every corner. The prisoner reached the junction where Eastern Corridor met the main detention wing, dropped to one knee, and put 3 rounds through the wall at angles that should have been guesses, but weren't. On the other side, An attacker went down with hits to shoulder and thigh. Precise enough to disable without killing. Professional enough to make Kaplan grab his radio and demand answers from Washington about who exactly they had been holding in Cell 7. But Washington wasn't answering, not yet, because the duty officer on the other end was frantically searching through classified databases for a file that shouldn't exist. The firefight moved deeper into the facility. The assault team tried to reach the classified servers in the administration wing, where detention logs and interrogation files were stored, the kind of intelligence that could burn networks across 2 hemispheres. The prisoner intercepted them at the server room door. He didn't charge in with overwhelming force. Instead, he used the facility's architecture against them, funneling the attackers into a kill box where their numbers became a disadvantage. 4 hostiles went down in 90 seconds, not dead, but combat ineffective, and the rest fell back to regroup. That gave the CIA officers time to fortify positions and start asking questions that didn't have easy answers. How did a prisoner know the facility layout better than some people who worked there? Why was he defending the servers instead of trying to escape? And why did the assault team's radio chatter, now intercepted by the signals team, include references to a call sign that wasn't in any file Torres could access? At 3:04 a.m., the prisoner did something that made 2 contractors freeze mid-reload. He spoke for the first time since his capture, just 2 words into his radio that he shouldn't have had access to. And every CIA officer in the facility heard them through their earpieces. The words were in Arabic, spoken with native fluency, and they made the assault team pause for exactly 3 seconds before resuming their advance with renewed aggression. Torres didn't speak Arabic, but he recognized tone. That wasn't a plea or a threat. It was a challenge, the kind operators used when they wanted enemies to know they'd walked into a trap. And judging by the way the attackers responded, they knew exactly who had just spoken. The prisoner moved to the central corridor intersection and activated a wall panel that CIA didn't know existed. His fingers moved across a keypad with muscle memory, entering a 12-digit code that unlocked a security protocol buried so deep in the facility's systems that even Kaplan didn't have clearance for it. Red emergency lights shifted to blue, a frequency change that meant something to someone. At 3:14 a.m., 27 minutes into the assault, every electronic device the attackers were carrying went dead simultaneously. Thermal optics, radios, weapon-mounted targeting systems, everything running on frequencies that someone had very carefully mapped during what everyone assumed was passive detention. The assault team went dark and blind in enemy territory. That was when the defensive advantage shifted completely. The prisoner moved through corridors with CIA officers now following his lead instead of trying to stop him. He cleared the facility room by room with efficiency that came from someone who had either designed the defensive plan or trained with people who had. By 3:31 a.m., the remaining attackers were either down or retreating through the breaches they had created. They left behind equipment and 2 wounded who were immediately secured by contractors, who were starting to realize this entire scenario had been something other than a prison break. The wounded weren't talking, but their gear told a story. Russian manufacture, Chinese optics, financing that pointed to networks operating in places where U.S. intelligence had been trying to penetrate for 18 months. The same 18 months the prisoner had been deep cover before his capture in Yemen. Torres started connecting dots that didn't appear in any official briefing. The JSOC helicopter arrived at 3:52 a.m. 2 Blackhawks with a Delta Force direct action team that fast-roped into the compound expecting to find a massacre. Instead, they found a secured facility with minimal casualties and a prisoner standing in the center of the motor pool with his hands raised and his eyes on the horizon like he was waiting for someone specific. The Delta team leader stepped forward, looked at the man's face, and his hand went to his radio with the urgency of someone who just recognized a ghost. The conversation that followed was 60 seconds of encrypted burst transmission that Torres couldn't hear but could read in body language. The way the team leader's posture changed from tactical alert to something closer to respect. Kaplan demanded answers and got a phone call instead. Routed through channels that bypassed normal CIA command structure, it came directly from a deputy director whose name didn't appear on any organizational chart. The conversation lasted 4 minutes, and when it ended, Kaplan looked at the man from Cell 7 with the expression of someone who just learned they had been holding a live grenade for 11 days. The prisoner wasn't a prisoner at all. He was a NOC, a non-official cover operative, deep penetration asset who had spent 18 months inside the terror network that just attacked the facility. His capture had been voluntary, staged, necessary to maintain the cover that would keep him alive long enough to identify the cell's leadership structure and map their operational networks. The assault wasn't a rescue. It was a purge, an attempt by the cell to eliminate a suspected infiltrator before he could transmit what he knew. The prisoner had been counting on the attack because it was the confirmation he needed that his intelligence was solid and the network was compromised enough to take desperate action. The restraints had been theater. The silence had been discipline. The 11 days of waiting had been the longest part of an operation that started in a Sana'a marketplace and ended in a Polish forest with bodies that would never be identified and equipment that would disappear into evidence lockers requiring presidential authorization to access. Torres watched as the Delta team treated the man like one of their own, which he probably had been at some point in a career that existed only in databases with encryption that would take quantum computers years to break. The prisoner finally spoke again, this time in English, asking about extraction protocols and debrief schedules with the casual tone of someone discussing weekend plans. At 4:17 a.m., a third helicopter arrived. This one had no markings, no identification, no official flight plan. The prisoner walked to it without handcuffs, without escort, without anyone trying to stop him. Kaplan received a second call, instructing him to scrub every reference to Marcus Webb from facility records and never speak of this incident to anyone without direct authorization from the Deputy Director of Operations. The sun rose at 5:43 a.m. over Site Amber 7. Contractors patched the fence breaches, engineers repaired the generator building, and a cleaning crew that arrived from Warsaw with security clearances, exceeding most generals, began removing evidence that anything unusual had happened. Torres filed his report and watched it get classified above his access level before he even finished typing. 3 weeks later, a memo circulated through CIA counterterrorism divisions. A major terror network operating across Yemen, Syria, and the Horn of Africa had been rolled up in coordinated raids by forces from 4 countries. 47 arrests, including 3 cell leaders who had been ghosts for over a decade. The intelligence that made it possible came from a source identified only as Amber Ghost. Torres never learned the prisoner's real name. He never found out which agency actually ran him or how many operations he had been part of before Site Amber 7. But 6 months later, at a joint agency briefing in Virginia, he saw a photograph on a classified presentation slide showing a man in local dress standing in a Damascus marketplace, face partially obscured. But Torres recognized the eyes. The same eyes that had scanned the corridor on that night in Poland. The same posture, the same economy of movement, the same presence that said this person had been trained by the best and had survived things that would break most operators. The caption under the photo read, "Asset still active. Do not approach." Torres understood then that some people never stop serving. They just serve in ways that can never be acknowledged, in places that don't exist, against enemies who think they're invisible. And on rare occasions, when everything goes wrong and a black site in Poland gets hit by the very network they've spent 18 months infiltrating, they break their own restraints and defend the people who were holding them captive, because that's what the mission requires. The man from Cell 7 was never seen again at Site Amber 7. His file was sealed, his fingerprints scrubbed from databases, his DNA profile removed from matching systems. If you asked CIA about Marcus Webb, you would get blank stares and database errors. The official record showed that Cell 7 had been empty for maintenance during the time period in question. But the 12 CIA officers who were there that night knew better. They knew they had shared a facility with someone who operated in shadows so deep that even intelligence agencies lost track. Someone who could wait in silence for 11 days because he had waited longer in worse places. Someone who could snap steel restraints and defend a black site, because that was just another Tuesday in a career built on impossible operations. Torres eventually transferred to a different posting. He never spoke about that night except once, years later, to a friend over drinks who had the right clearances. When asked what the most intense moment of his career had been, Torres didn't describe interrogations or raids or any of the official operations that filled his personnel file. He described watching a prisoner who wasn't a prisoner take control of a tactical situation with the kind of expertise that made Delta Force operators treat him like a peer. And he described the strange feeling of knowing that somewhere in the world, that same man was still out there, still operating, still doing the work that couldn't be done in daylight. The assault on Site Amber 7 never made the news. The terror network that was dismantled 3 weeks later barely got a footnote in intelligence summaries. And the man who made it possible remained what he had always been. A ghost in the machine. Invisible, but essential. The kind of operator who proved that the most dangerous weapon in any arsenal wasn't technology or firepower, but a human being willing to disappear into enemy territory and stay there until the mission was complete. Years after that night in Poland, in a small office buried deep within CIA headquarters, a file marked Amber Ghost remained active in systems that few people knew existed. The file contained no photographs, no fingerprints, no identifying information that could compromise the asset in the field. Just a series of operational summaries documenting intelligence gathered from places where American intelligence had no official presence. Each summary ended with the same notation. Asset remains deployed. Contact status irregular. Recall not recommended. Translation: somewhere in the world, the man from Cell 7 was still doing what he did best, still walking the razor's edge between cover and exposure, still gathering intelligence that saved lives and prevented attacks that would never make headlines because they never happened. Torres thought about that sometimes, during the quiet moments between assignments when his mind wandered to that night in Poland. He thought about what it took to live that kind of life, to never be able to go home, to maintain a cover so deep that even capture and detention couldn't break it. He thought about the kind of person who could sit in a cell for 11 days without speaking, knowing that rescue wasn't coming because rescue would blow the operation. And he thought about the moment when everything changed, when the prisoner who wasn't a prisoner had broken free and fought alongside the people holding him captive. because that's what the mission required. That level of commitment, that depth of cover, that willingness to blur every line until the distinction between prisoner and protector disappeared completely. Torres never shared these thoughts with anyone, not even the friend with clearances. Some things were too heavy to speak aloud, too complicated to explain to people who hadn't been there. The weight of knowing that somewhere out there, someone was living a life of perpetual deception, perpetual danger, perpetual isolation, all so that people like Torres could sleep soundly in beds that never moved, in houses that had addresses, in lives that made sense. The file would remain active for years, decades maybe, until one day the summaries would stop coming, and someone in that small office would mark the file as ASSETPRESUMEDLOSTRECOVERYNOTPOSSIBLE. No funeral, no memorial, no recognition, just a file that closed like a book finishing its last chapter, and somewhere in the world, a ghost would finally rest. But that day hadn't come yet. The man from Cell 7 was still out there, still moving through enemy territory with the same efficiency he had shown in Poland, still gathering intelligence that would prevent the next attack, the next catastrophe, the next headline that never happened, still serving in ways that could never be acknowledged, protecting people who would never know his name. The aftermath of Site Amber 7 rippled through intelligence circles in ways that would never be documented. Training protocols were updated based on lessons learned from the assault, though the specific incident that prompted those changes remained classified. Security procedures at black sites worldwide were strengthened, and the man who made it possible continued his silent work somewhere in the shadows. Kaplan retired 18 months after the incident. He never spoke publicly about that night, but in private conversations with other site chiefs, he would sometimes mention the importance of really knowing who you were holding. The subtext was clear. Sometimes the most dangerous person in your facility wasn't a threat, and sometimes your most valuable asset looked exactly like your worst enemy. The Delta operators who had responded returned to their regular assignments, but one team leader kept a photograph that should never have existed. It showed the motor pool at Site Amber 7 in pre-dawn light, with a figure standing at the center waiting for extraction. Years later, when training new operators, he would describe a scenario that was really Site Amber 7 with the details obscured. The trainees never knew they were hearing about a real operation. The man from Cell 7, the prisoner who wasn't a prisoner, the ghost who defended his captors because that was what the mission required. Amber Ghost. Asset still active. Contact status irregular. Recall not recommended. Somewhere in the world tonight, he was still out there, still serving, still invisible, still essential. And that made all the difference. Comment below. Have you ever met someone who turned out to be completely different than you first thought? What city are you watching from? Site Amber 7 stood silent in the Polish forest, its operations continuing without pause. Its personnel rotated in and out on schedules designed to prevent familiarity and compromise. The cell where the man had waited for 11 days held new occupants now, people who really were prisoners, people who didn't have the training or the cover or the mission that had protected the ghost who had once occupied that space. The contractors who patched the fence never spoke about what they had seen. The engineers who repaired the generator never mentioned the precision of the explosive placement, how it had been designed to disable rather than destroy, how it had borne the hallmarks of someone who knew exactly how much force to use and where to apply it. The assault team that had attacked the facility disappeared into the same bureaucratic void. Their bodies were never recovered, their identities never confirmed, their existence never officially acknowledged. The wounded who had been captured were processed through channels that didn't appear on any organizational chart. The intelligence they provided filled in gaps that had frustrated counterterrorism analysts for months. Networks were mapped, cells were identified, operations were disrupted. Lives were saved in numbers that could never be calculated because the attacks never happened and the victims never knew they had been targets. The invisible mathematics of intelligence work, where success was measured in things that didn't occur. And at the center of it all, the ghost who had made it possible continued his work in silence, his existence known only to the few people who managed his file, and the enemies who were starting to realize that someone had penetrated their networks too deeply. Someone with training that matched their best operators, someone with access that shouldn't have been possible, someone who had been playing a long game that was only now revealing its true depth. That was the bridge the man had crossed. Not just between enemy and ally, not just between captor and captive, but between all the categories that made sense in normal operations. He existed in the space where those distinctions blurred and disappeared, where the only truth was the mission, and everything else was negotiable. Torres understood that now, in ways he hadn't before that night in Poland. The man who had crossed every bridge and burned them all behind him, who had chosen isolation over recognition, anonymity over acknowledgement, service over self. Still protecting people who would never know his name or his sacrifice. Still serving in silence, because some battles are won not with medals and recognition, but with anonymity and the willingness to become a legend that officially never existed. The terror network that had been rolled up continued to generate intelligence years after the initial arrests. The cell leaders who had been captured provided information under interrogation that led to additional operations, additional arrests, additional disruptions of planned attacks. But the source of the original intelligence that had made everything possible remained classified at the highest levels. Only a handful of people knew that a single operator, working alone in deep cover for 18 months, had provided the foundation for everything that followed. That one man had gathered the kind of intelligence that usually required entire teams of analysts, surveillance assets, and signal intelligence operations. And he had done it while maintaining a cover so deep that even his capture had been part of the plan. The art of deep cover wasn't just maintaining a false identity, Torres had learned. It was maintaining multiple false identities, each one protecting the others, each one serving a specific purpose, each one designed to be burned if necessary while preserving the core mission. The man from Cell 7 had been a master of that art, and somewhere in classified training facilities, his techniques would be studied by the next generation of ghosts. But his name would never be attached to those lessons. His face would never appear in any training materials. His career would never be acknowledged as the template it had become. Because that was the price of the work, the cost of operating in shadows. Excellence without recognition, sacrifice without memorial, service without acknowledgement. The file would continue to generate summaries, each one documenting operations that prevented attacks the world would never hear about. Each one proof that the ghost was still out there, still moving through enemy territory, still doing what needed to be done in places where conventional forces could never operate. And Torres would carry the memory of that night in Poland for the rest of his career. A reminder that the most important work often happened in the shadows, performed by people whose names would never be known, whose sacrifices would never be acknowledged, whose service would never be rewarded with anything more than the knowledge that they had done what needed to be done. Just a ghost in the machine, invisible but essential. Still serving, still protecting, still making the difference that no one would ever know about.